The Invisible Stalker is a criminally underused creature. Summoned from another plane, these creatures will complete a job you give them, but that doesn't mean you should expect them to be very happy about it. Wizards have been summoning these creatures since the early days of Dungeons & Dragons, and we can only imagine the intense hatred they feel for those abusive, arcane, power-wielding jerks. Revenge is sweet, however, and if they get the chance, they'll pervert your words to gain their freedom. The job will always get done, but not exactly how you were planning. Let's try and take a look at the Invisible Stalker. That's going to be difficult, since they're invisible. The Invisible Stalker is first mentioned in the White Box Book 1 Men in Magic, released in 1974 for the original Dungeons & Dragons, but isn't presented as an actual monster until Book 2 Monsters and Treasures, released in the same year. The creature first appears as one of the most powerful magic user spells, the 6th level spell Invisible Stalker. This spell allows the caster to summon an extra-dimensional being who is, we can only infer from the name of the spell, invisible, and a stalker. When you cast this spell, you summon the creature and give it a mission to accomplish. It will then carry out this mission until it is destroyed or the mission is finished, at which point it will then return to its home dimension. Looking at the monster's lore, they are from a non-dimension and are faultless trackers capable of tracking down anyone or anything. This sounds great if you're looking to enact revenge on someone, or really bad if you're the one being hunted. Now, you might think you could abuse this spell by trying to give the Invisible Stalker an impossible task, or at least a very long task, like protecting you for a year from all harm. That's one way to make your summoned creature hate your guts, as they hate being away from their non-dimension, extra-dimension place. We aren't really sure the difference between an extra dimension and a non-dimension, but we feel like that's kind of an important detail to get right, especially if you're an Invisible Stalker who wants to get back home. The longer the task an Invisible Stalker is tasked with, the worse off it is going to be for the summoner, unless they are incredibly clear with their commands. If you tell an Invisible Stalker to protect your treasure from thieves, then they will pervert the spirit of your commands while obeying it to the letter. They'll take your wealth and whisk it off to their home, where they will then take good care of it, thus protecting it from other creatures, since it's on a completely different dimension, one that might not even exist. This extends to many other tasks, and the longer something takes to accomplish, the more likely it is that the Invisible Stalker is going to screw around with your commands until you regret the day you ever summoned it. Invisible Stalkers hold a grudge and hate being away from their homes, so make sure your tasks are quick and you thank them for all their hard work.
The not-so-visible Invisible Stalker appears in the Moldvay Cook Expert Set from 1981 and the BECMI Expert Rules from 1983. They once again appear alongside the 6th level magic user spell Invisible Stalker that gives some control over them by a summoner. They are from another plane of existence, which is probably better than being from a non-dimensional space, and are just as testy about spending too much time away from home as they were before. We get it. The longer we are away from our couch, the grumpier we get too. Interestingly enough, the Invisible Stalker can be dispelled before it has accomplished its goal by a clever casting Dispel Evil on them, even though they are neutral aligned. This expulsion causes them to go back to their native plane, and the same happens if they are killed outside their native plane. To us, that just seems like a great option if we are constantly being harassed to go kill someone or retrieve an item. Just walk into death so that you can get back home sooner. Beats having to listen to Wendrick the Wise go on and on about their master plans and powerful spellcasting abilities. Of course, if you do decide to summon an Invisible Stalker, make sure to keep the mission at hand rather short. They'll pervert the spirit of your mission, causing it to go poorly for you, and you'll only have yourself to blame for not wording your commands properly. The poor Invisible Stalker is just trying to do its best and only has your best interests at heart, especially if you're planning to keep it on your plane for a long time away from its invisible family. Okay, maybe not. The last mention of the Invisible Stalker comes in the BECMI Companion Rules set from 1984, which reveals that the term Invisible Stalker is a term that humans came up with for the race. Invisible Stalkers actually refer to themselves as the Shishai people, and they reside on the elemental plane of air. The Shishai act kinda like doppelgangers on their home plane, though they really do so with evil intents, as they prefer negotiations to violence. They are often hired by the Jinn and other plane of air natives to act as spies or mercenaries, and some have been known to cast a few spells. We have to wonder if a few of the Shishai spellcasters have been working on a summon magic user spell to get some revenge on those pompous jerks.
The Invisible Stalker is released in the Advanced Dungeons & Dragons Monster Manual, released in 1977, and is also found as a 6th level magic user spell Invisible Stalker in the Player's Handbook, released in 1978. This edition reaffirms that these poor creatures are from the plane of air, and that they just want to be left alone in their home plane. You can also bump into them in the astral or ethereal plane, though you'll be able to see them so you won't actually bump into them. When they exist on those planes, or if someone has cast See Invisibility, then they can see the dim outline of something. It's not specified what shape these creatures have, so maybe it's like a cloud or it is humanoid shaped. The Invisible Stalker isn't totally screwed over if they are summoned by a spellcaster. Sure, they have to complete whatever task the conjurer gives them and maybe die to complete the task, but they aren't killed if they die outside their home plane. If they are killed, then they simply reform on the plane of air and are free of all responsibilities. They can only truly be killed if you head on over to the plane of air and kill them there, which might be a bit difficult since they're invisible. Of course, the Invisible Stalker isn't exactly thrilled when they are summoned to complete some silly task like fetching the salt from the kitchen counter, but so long as it is a short task, they'll do it and then quickly go home without too many bad thoughts, except to whatever magic user decided it was a good idea to create a spell that summoned them. We bet they'd love to rip that spellcaster's skin off. If you happen to give them a task that takes longer than a week, you should be prepared for a rather annoyed servant. As the hate begins building up in them, they start twisting your words and begin finding different ways to ruin your carefully laid out plan. For every day the Invisible Stalker needs to complete its task, the chances of it trying to mess up your mission and gain its freedom increases by 1%. Our advice is to make sure the job takes less than 100 days, or just summon a bunch of Invisible Stalkers. Maybe companionship will make them more likely to stick to your plan. Maybe you can even summon a whole family of Invisible Stalkers as a type of work vacation.
The Invisible Stalker first appears in the Monstrous Compendium Volume 1 from 1989, and later reprinted in the Monstrous Manual from 1993. And we begin to flesh out, not literally of course, the creature's abilities and ecology. They don't use weapons or strike you with fists, but use the wind and air itself to deliver damaging blows, so just imagine what it's like to get pummeled by a bunch of mini tornadoes. In addition to being beings of pure air, they are also wholly invisible, so now imagine those mini tornadoes are also invisible as they tear through you and your allies. Of course, you could always convince your wizard to prepare See Invisibility, though they may not even realize what they are looking at as an Invisible Stalker, as the true form of these creatures is completely unknown. While on the material, astral, or ethereal plane, they only appear as a shimmering air mass, like that from hot air passing in front of cold air. Not the most helpful of descriptions that a wizard could yell out to their allies. The Invisible Stalker resides on the plane of air, and very little, if anything, is known of their life there. They are still invisible in that plane, like most of the creatures that live there, so their society might involve them bumping into each other a lot and mumbled apologies to one another. Speaking of apologies, Invisible Stalkers have their own language, which is said to sound like that of a windstorm with booming thunder and gale-force winds. Luckily for you, you don't have to speak air and storms, as they all understand common, but they just can't speak it. If you do happen to want to speak to an Invisible Stalker, like if you cast the 6th level Invisible Stalker spell found in the Player's Handbook, remember to mind your words and manners, as you are summoning them against their will. We feel fairly confident that Invisible Stalkers probably think that any job they are tasked with is stupid and asinine, so be careful. They'll do the job you give them, trying to accomplish it until it's done. They are dispelled, or they die trying, and are forced to reform on the plane of air. If this job takes too long, though, they have their own life they'd like to be living and will begin twisting your task, perverting the spirit of the one-sided agreement until you grow to regret your decisions, if you live long enough. Invisible Stalkers have resentment and some an outright hatred for humanoids, as they are troublemakers who keep pulling them away from their Invisible Stalker families. If they happen to spot some humanoids traveling through the plane of air, they are more than happy to let out some of this pent-up aggression out and kill them. Then again, maybe you've been nice to them and somehow made friends with an Invisible Stalker. In this case, word gets around their communities, and you are far less likely to get torn to shreds by howling winds and angry storms. In the Monstrous Compendium, Mystara Appendix from 1994, the Shishai return and is the name of the Invisible Stalker race, though only for those that reside in Mystara, though not even the other inhabitants of this world refer to them by this name, still calling them Invisible Stalkers. It goes to show that giving yourself a nickname never works, and you'll find yourself talking in the third person trying to make it stick. The last worthwhile mention of the Invisible Stalker appears in the Planescape Monstrous Compendium Appendix 3 from 1998. On the plane of air, invisible stalkers finally find some peace, living in the floating castles of the Jinn. They are no longer hunters or trackers, but instead serve as great sages and lore keepers.
We find the Invisible Stalker in the 3rd edition Monster Manual, released in 2000 and then released again in 2003. And any interesting advancements that were made in the previous edition stall out. These creatures get a brief 2 paragraphs of rehashed information adapted to this edition, and even loses a 6th level spell specifically for summoning it, and is now lumped in with the generic summoning spell Summon Monster 7 in the Player's Handbook released in 2003. Though this does have the benefit for the summoner, and still not the Invisible Stalker, that they can now be summoned by druids since they can cast Summon Nature's Ally 7. Again, this is only nice for summoners, not the Invisible Stalker, who just wants to be left alone. The Invisible Stalker is an amorphous creature, and simply casting See Invisibility only reveals a vague outline of a cloud as it begins ripping the flesh from your bones. If you cast True Seeing, you'll be able to see a bit more detail and witness a roiling cloud of vapors ripping the flesh from your bones. If you are hoping to plead your case to the Invisible Stalker, luckily they understand Common, though they can't speak it, and are only able to speak Auran. You'll just have to wait and see what they do next after you try to talk them down from killing you. And if you are hoping to hide from an Invisible Stalker hell-bent on tracking you down and killing you, well, bad news. They're really good at tracking down creatures, as it's kind of in their name, and are some of the best trackers you can summon and then piss off with a task for them to accomplish when all they want to do is relax at home.
We don't want to bash on the 4th edition since so many people already do, but we can't help feel insulted for the Invisible Stalker, who is relegated to Heroes of the Elemental Chaos from 2012, never appearing in one of the 3 monster manuals. Then again, maybe the Invisible Stalker is actually excited that they don't have to be dragged away from their home in the Elemental Chaos, able to finally enjoy a bit of peace and quiet without having to do some wizard's bidding simply because they are too lazy to do it. If that's the case, then we are sorry to say that the Invisible Stalker is stuck with being just a summoned creature using the 15th level daily wizard attack power called Summon Invisible Stalker. At least the Invisible Stalker is only forced to stick around so long as the battle is ongoing, which makes it really hard for it to pervert any contracts it might have to sign. The Invisible Stalker is a unique creature in that it is a summon, and so it doesn't have any actions of its own. Instead, you have to spend your own actions to mentally command it to move, attack, or use any of the other abilities it has listed in its stat block. Commanding the creature results in you sharing knowledge, but you have no access to its senses, so you can't gaze through its eyes or hear through it. If you do summon an Invisible Stalker, it takes a portion of your own power, getting stronger as you get stronger. This does have the drawback that if it is reduced to 0 hit points, you lose one of your healing surges, which is a representation of your ability to carry on in an adventuring day. You can avoid that outcome, especially if the Invisible Stalker is in danger of dying, by dismissing them earlier in the fight. We assume that they get to go back home until you drag them back out again without consulting them. Sadly, this is the extent of the Invisible Stalker in 4th edition. They no longer roam the plane of air, especially since it's been absorbed into the elemental chaos, and there is no mention of it wandering the astral sea. They only serve one purpose in life, which is to hunt down and kill your enemies.
The Invisible Stalker makes a triumphant return to the 5th edition Monster Manual released in 2014, though triumphant might be the wrong word. In fact, we can't even see it, so we aren't sure if it looks triumphant or just incredibly upset. The Invisible Stalker starts its life as a lowly air elemental before a summoner uses some magic and transforms it into an Invisible Stalker, shaping it from a normal elemental into a specific form. Once summoned, the Invisible Stalker has one purpose: hunt down the creature or object that the jerk that summoned it wants, and then maybe kill it or bring the object back to the summoner. If you summon an Invisible Stalker, it will follow you around until you give it a quarry to find, though it doesn't specify how long they are willing to wait for your orders. It could be that there are forgetful wizards who have summoned dozens of them, and because they can't see them, forgot to issue their tasks and just keep summoning more of them to do its bidding, but always forgetting to issue a task. It can be rough being an Invisible Stalker. These tasks often involve tracking someone or something down, and once it accomplishes its task, it then still has work to do. The Invisible Stalker is no longer released from captivity after a successful murder, but now must serve until the wizard dies, the magic binding it to the summoner dissipates, or something else happens, like the Invisible Stalker dies. Once it finishes one task, it must then return to the summoner and get another task, and continue fulfilling task after task. This just goes to make the Invisible Stalker angrier and angrier. As you can well imagine, it's not a fan of the person that summons it and is quite resentful of any job you give it. Long-term assignments make it angry, and while there's no 1% anger increase per day, you don't want to give it a year-long task. It will seek different ways to twist a job's intent unless it is worded carefully, but even then, that might not save you. They have nothing but time to twist your words against you. The Invisible Stalker has long been a monster relegated to the sidelines with little thought made about them. There have been a few bright spots where they have been given interesting lore, but that is quickly taken away from them. Despite it all, the Invisible Stalker still just wants to be left alone and live out its life, and those who try to control them are in for disaster when they task it with a job longer than a few minutes.